Hello and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Dr. Claudy Kamp, Senior Lecturer at Bournemouth University. We will discuss the book, A History of Intellectual Property in 50 Objects, which she edited with Dan Hunter and which will be published by Cambridge University Press. So welcome to the podcast, Claudy.
Hi, Brian.
It's such a pleasure to have you on. As you know, I'm a huge fan of this project. I've read a few of the essays that some people have circulated online already, and I just can't wait to read the rest of the essays in the book.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I can't wait to hear what you think about it too, because you've been such a enthusiastic supporter since the beginning. So I would love to hear what you think about the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, so I also have a ton of questions, right? Because I love this project so much, I really wanted to learn more from you about the context in which it was created. So sort of how did the project get started? What sort of context were you thinking about when you initially started working on it? And sort of how did it actually come together with you and Dan editing it?
Wow. Okay, so there's a few angles to that in answering that. So I guess in general, as academics, we face questions such as, what is the best way to reach my audience, or how do you make research tangible to, say, a relatively lay audience? How do you package it up so that it speaks to people? There's so much academic research that is so jargon heavy, I guess, that it only circulates in sort of these niches, and it speaks to the converted. So the world out there, so to speak, is very, very good at packaging their messages, right, to wider audience. So in 2010, which is of course what this is based on, there was the podcast A History of the World in 100 Objects, and that was done as 100-part series, if I'm not mistaken, for BBC Radio by Neil MacGregor, who was the then director of the British Museum, and it explored world history from, I think, as far as 2 million years ago to the present in 100 objects of the British Museum. And then about a year later or so, a book with the same title followed, and then that just turned out to be this killer formula. The world caught on very quickly, and lots of interesting spin-offs followed. So, history of cricket in 100 objects, and all sorts of other things. And then Dan, together with his friend Greg Listelka, who unfortunately passed away in the meantime, they were sort of toying with this idea: could you do this with intellectual property? And there was a few messages back and forth in which they sort of quickly put a list together of like, what would you put in there? And then I guess it stalled for a little bit, not only because Greg became very ill, but Dan also started Swinburne Law School. So that was, not a small feat. And then when I applied for a postdoc in, I want to say 2015. Am I getting this right? Yeah, I think so. So 4 years ago, Dan told me in the first conversation I had with him prior to applying that whoever he was going to hire for this job was going to work on this book with him. And that to me sort of sounded like, magical music, because it just seemed to bring together all sorts of things that I really like doing. So I really like editing, but I also have a visual background, and the the designing and the rights clearance of the images came much later, but I sort of have a background in several of these things, and I saw the prospect of this project. And long story short, I got the job, and then we sort of started working on it, right? And then piece by piece, it's actually really nice to think about it now as this amazing journey that, from very small, every step along the way, like, more and more questions came up. And yeah, here we are 4 years later. It's about to come out.
Yeah. And it sounds like the project started with the objects. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of like examples of what kind of objects were chosen and why, and whether there were changes in the objects you wanted to profile in the course of the development of the book.
Yeah. Again, I mean, you please stop me when you want me to stop talking, because I can talk about this for days.
Be my guest.
Yes. So in the larger sense, I want to say it's been for a very long time one big puzzle, right? You try to not only have interesting objects that reflect all the regimes in a sort of representative way, but also at the same time, you're looking for people to match with those objects, and vice versa. So at some point, and that's because of Dan's background and his research into sort of objects more generally. So, his interest in furniture design, but also luxury items, and his research into Barbie and Lego, that really sort of lend itself to that idea. And an early iteration of this book had as a theme, when I wasn't part of that, so IP and the home. So that was really an idea that they started sort of flashing out. And then from that, it sort of developed into much more general 50 objects, and we started thinking about that. I think we moved away from, say, 100 right away, because that seemed an awful lot, especially in light of how long every chapter needed to be. So we sort of settled on 50, and it turned out to be a good amount. But then you start thinking about what has to be in here, what could be in here, what is too special or too niche for a part one. But let's say that this is a one-off book. So there were things like, we have a master list that is incredibly long, and everybody that you spoke to, you would have this conversation, and people had great ideas, right? So you start sort of collecting all these objects. But for instance, you start talking about themes like, okay, we need to do something on music. What would be a good object that would represent that? We obviously need to do something on medium. What are the very early objects before there even was an intellectual property system? Which two are going to bookend the book, and what do they have, in common? For instance, are we going to do the Alexander Graham Bell telephone and the iPhone? So constantly these conversations and questions, and then just finessing it along the way, I want to say. Yeah. I'm going to stop.
Yeah. Well, it always has struck me that there's this delightful irony in the project, insofar as, sort of the only sort of coherent definition that I've ever been able to settle on for intellectual property is some sort of, intangible knowledge goods. And so there's this wonderful kind of humor in studying the intangible through the lens of the tangible and looking for something tangible as it's sort of like intangible in the sort of tangible residue of it, as it were.
No, that's exactly it. I mean, in the introduction, we describe a couple of reasons why we focus on objects, because of course we could have written a book, on the laws that were enacted. So why that focus on objects, and of course. One of the major reasons is because they are tangible, which makes them interesting in the context of IP. And this came up in the workshop that we did in Rome over the summer. So IP law aspires for this separation between what we've ended up calling the thing and the idea of the thing, right? Ideas cannot be protected. It's their tangible expressions that can be. But IP law also serves to remind us that it's never possible to entirely separate that thing from the idea of the thing. So, and I think the Barbie doll is a really great chapter that shows that the doll is a tangible expression, right? Of a toy that was originally protected by a patent, but it's also a company's attempt through its litigation strategy to protect that doll's chaste image. So I think the tension between those things is really sort of palpable in that chapters and many like it.
Were there other objects that you thought were particularly essential to the book project? And if so, why those objects?
Yeah, good question. We organized a round table in Melbourne and had local sort of specialists and people invested in the project sit around the table. And at that time, we had produced a dummy, which I think was about half of the book or so, 25 objects. But before we opened them on the table, we sort of went around the table and said, with a title like this, what would you expect to be absolutely in this book? And perhaps the answers weren't that surprising. So it was, if I remember correctly, the light bulb, that had to be in here. I think people at the time did say the iPhone, and that has been on our master list for a long time. But then we decided not to use the iPhone, but go for the Alexander Graham Bell telephone. What else was on that original list? I think there must have been things that actually then didn't make it into the final book, because, like I said, it wasn't just objects, right? It was also people, it was authors, it was their specialisms, and so it sort of became this organic process of then matching them. And then, there was a lot of like, if this, then that, and what if, so it was constantly that puzzle. Like, do we have enough trademark? Do we have enough copyright? Do we have enough patent? And so on.
Are there any particular objects that you're like especially proud of them being maybe a little unexpected, but bringing some richness to the project that people might be surprised or interested by?
Yeah, no, very, very good question. My personal surprise entry is actually the football of all things. Like I didn't, well, in general, I don't know a lot about football, but also as an entry, I had no idea. And then when it came in and it makes that link between 1970, Mexico, television, white balls not showing up, but that hexagonal black and white one, designed to show up on television screens. All of a sudden, it had such a link to what I think I do, that it was just, I don't know, sort of mind-blowing as like, wow, something as ubiquitous as the football, even, maybe especially that this link to IP. I have to say, not because I'm speaking to you, but the Zapruder film is one of my favorite entries. It has always spoken to my imagination, that film, but I think being a little bit more distant from actually, putting the book together now, it actually makes me think that that entry specifically is so special in that history happens to everyday people. That's sort of what comes out of it. And perhaps even IP history happens to everyday people, right? I mean, Abraham Zapruder happens to have also a really special name on that day, decides, to go outside and then returns. The weather is not good enough and the weather breaks. His secretary says, "Why don't you stand on this cement column?" And then, films this. I mean, it's just such an incredibly rich story, and I think also very topical for the times that we live in. This private property of this object that is obviously in the interest of a larger audience. I think that story is just wonderful. There's a couple that were surprising to me because perhaps we had designed them in one way and then they came back in another. So, for instance, both the Kodak camera and the corset, they came back as these incredibly genderized ideas of the law, which I had personally never thought about. So that was really eye-opening, and those are, also beautifully written. I think that escalator to me is a wonderful entry. It was a chapter that was designed as an entry on, I guess, trademark genericide, and we had just chosen a picture of the escalator to open the chapter, but it sort of was designed to include many more brands, and it was just mocked up that way. But then it came back as not only a story about trademark genericide, but also a story that describes the history of the actual escalator and what an incredibly revolutionary invention it was, and how deeply it has impacted our lives and our experiences, and our idea of shopping. And it's just such an amazing story. Yeah, and so many. I mean, it's been such a joy, sort of, to see stories come back and really have people sort of also, I guess, because as we've asked people to do 3 things in a story: is speak about the object, then speak about the wider circle of the IP story surrounding it, and then an even wider circle around that about the social repercussions of that whole idea. But then that whole thing needed to be under 2,000 words and as footnoteless as possible, which as is probably very difficult for lawyers. And I've spoken to many contributors who found that a very difficult challenge, but also a rewarding one, because it sort of forces you to, not only get to the point, but also tell a story quite differently, as opposed to when you have an unlimited amount of words to your disposal. So that combination of how stories came back, and sometimes they need a little bit more shaping than in other cases, especially because it's so difficult to tell the story in around 2,000 words without any footnotes. So that's been really amazing.
So I wonder about the process of selecting contributors as well. And did you seek out particular contributors because you thought that they would have something special to add about a particular object? Were there any objects that you included in part or in whole because you had a contributor that you thought would be really perfect to write about them? And sort of what kind of surprises, if any, did you see from people's approach, not just factually to the objects, but
Mm-hmm.
also in terms of sort of different people's styles, because
Yeah.
it's such a wide range of different people who
Mm-hmm.
you've got
Mm-hmm.
working on the project.
Yeah. So yes to all of that. Well, in some cases, we had an object, and then we'd be looking for people. In other cases, we'd have a person, and then either we proposed an object, or they proposed an object. If we just had sort of like, we have to have that person and then see what they would propose. And sometimes we would develop it with them, and perhaps they were like, choosing between two, and then we would sort of say like, oh, that would fit better because some contributors suggested each other. So that was really interesting. We have two people who are married to each other. We have two contributors that turn out to be cousins. It's really fun. But we also tried, there was this, the idea of diversity, not only in gender, but also geographical spreading, and also, I guess, career maturity, so to speak. So we also wanted to include all the way, from PhD students to late career IP professors. So that sort of had to be in somewhat of a balance. But then for some objects, we had very specific ideas. So, for instance, for the Coca-Cola bottle, we just assumed that had to be someone American, which it turns out is now the case, and is actually, a beautiful, beautiful chapter. Questions of gender. So, for instance, if you let an entry on the Viagra pill be written by a man versus a woman, would you get a different story? Things like that. So some of those issues we've actually actively pursued, whereas others, I think we were, I guess, pleasantly surprised. In terms of surprises, I think you said with entries, I kind of want to say it's perhaps the interdisciplinarity of it. So where the authors are interdisciplinary themselves and approach IP from a different angle, I want to say that those stories tended to come in much more fully formed, perhaps because, the social repercussions of the story of an object would already be part of the story of how they came to the object, if that makes sense, as opposed to so for instance, the Betamax, wonderfully written by Julian Thomas, knows everything there is to know about IP, but is a historian and media scholar. So the way he approached that story was very much about, yes, there is this landmark decision, but what does that mean? What does that mean for this idea of time shifting? What does this mean for that? Today we have Netflix, and so I think those stories tended to be incredibly rich already in a first draft, because people just got what the idea of the book was, and that was very very satisfying to see.
Yeah. So I mean, it's always struck me that, in some ways, like, our concepts of different intellectual property regimes are extremely globalized. People do business globally, and these objects circulate, most of them all around the world, and are familiar to people in all different places. And yet, in a lot of ways, there at least seem to be residual, much more localized, sort of normative concepts of, intellectual property and individual rights and knowledge goods and what they mean and sort of how we ought to think about them. Did you find that those kind of normative, kind of value laden aspects of intellectual property inflected the kinds of writing and perspectives that contributors had? Because, people who contributed to the book come from all around the world.
Yeah, I want to say absolutely. Not only, where they're from, but also, their disciplinary backgrounds. But also, I guess, some of those issues I think we might have also planted. The idea that the book has somewhat of an Australian origin predicts certain entries, and also a particular kind of looking at those issues. So there are things like, I kind of want to say, if the book had not had that origin, then something like the Mike Tyson tattoo that speaks about cultural appropriation, in particularly Maori culture, then that might have not ended up in the book. And the chapter is written from a particular kind of angle, and I think it's almost impossible to say that authors would be able to write in a sort of vacuum where that wouldn't play a role. I don't think that's philosophically possible. So yes, it's inflected in all entries, I want to say.
Yeah. So given its Australian origin, I have to ask, because I will confess I've forgotten. Is there a Vegemite chapter?
No, there's not. That would have been a really good one. Yeah, that's great. No, we have we have the polymer banknote, which finds its origin in Australia. We have the Qantas skybed. What else did we have? Yeah, so Mike Tyson tattoo, although it's a US case, but something else I keep forgetting, but yeah, it'll come back to me. No Vegemite.
Yeah. Are there any particular objects that you personally really wanted to see in the book, but that for one reason or another just didn't make the cut or couldn't quite fit into the project?
No, I think everything that we really wanted is in. Sometimes, of course, we had conversations about what about this and what about that, but sometimes you feel sort of sorry that something hasn't made the cut. But I feel personally very, very strongly about all of them that are in. I actually have to say that, and this might be of interest to the listeners, when you were such an enthusiastic supporter of the whole idea that you actually designed it as a contest for your students, and then we judged the essays, and then whoever won joined us in Rome for the ISHLEP conference. But I have to say that there were a couple of objects where I was like, whoa, these are so good, So I thought the Tiffany box was great, but also the Stradivarius that ended up winning, and I think the Jordan Nike shoe that was really great. So it's if anything, there's just more room for thought that opens up, and even now on maybe not on a daily basis anymore, but you kind of go around and hear about things, or you read about something, you go like, oh, that would make a really great entry. But there's this thing where for a while, and also some of the introduction to some of those other books that I mentioned, we looked at so many. So, the history of New York and 101 objects. So most of these books will say something in the introduction of along the lines of, have we set ourselves up for Mission Impossible in doing this? And I'm totally okay with it now. Like I don't think anymore that, and that's also, of course, why we chose the title "A History of IP" and not "The History." Some of these books are called, "The History of Australia," in 100 Objects, for instance. So this idea that there's a multitude of histories to tell. Like if you would have made this book, perhaps, some of the objects would have overlapped, but very likely you would have chosen, right, 50 different ones, and that's
Yeah.
okay. So
Yeah.
for a while, I was sort of stressing out about it, like, oh, is this okay? And, are we setting ourselves up for a failure because people are going to say, what about this and what about that? But maybe that's exactly what it needs to do. It needs to spark that conversation about what else could be part of it. And, maybe it says something about us as editors, about the particular history that we're telling through these 50 objects. And I think it's a jumping off point to a much larger conversation that I think is very interesting to have.
Well, so the book is going to be available for purchase really soon. And like I said, I'm just dying to read the rest of the essays in it because everything just looks fantastic. Assuming that it's the kind of runaway success that I expect it to be. Do you think there's room for like a follow-up project or alternative projects that might kind of look at the same body of ideas and cultural values in a similar but different or expanded way, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't necessarily think it would be, another history of IP in another 50 objects, but I think it might be because I also think that as a concept it lends itself to do this, but I don't know if it would be particularly interesting to make a part 2 or a part 3. It's but I do think there's an opening up as in terms of maybe spin-off ideas. So different pockets of those histories in other objects or in other, fill in the blanks. I think it's a particular way of packaging a message that really lends itself to, I guess, speaking to a larger audience, and that's really, I mean, that's new for me, but it's also new in for whoever I speak to, because in Bournemouth locally we do these public events for what's it called, like students of the third age, so elderly people who come to public presentations. And they particularly sort of connected to it, where it's like, oh, that's really interesting because it's so tangible that people who have no idea about intellectual property, it's something, fairly complicated, but to make that tangible in everyday objects, that has proven to be a particularly, I don't know, interesting way of speaking to people. And then perhaps in particular the lay audience. So I think as a package it's interesting. I don't know if you need to necessarily repeat it. But hey, I also want to say let's see how this one does, and then we'll cross the bridge when we'll get to it, to see if I can recommit to something like this.
Yeah, very cool. Well, Claudy, it's been really a pleasure talking to you.
So fun.
And
thank you.
Yeah, congratulations on this fantastic project. And please convey my admiration to Dan as well. And I can't wait to hold a copy of the book in my hands.
Me too. I've seen some test pages a couple of weeks ago, so that was very exciting to actually feel the actual paper and see the actual size. But now the next moment we're actually going to hold an entire book in all its 450 pages. So I'm very, very excited about that.
Cool. Well, I hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. This is really fun and really great to finally speak to you.
Johnny?
Yes, dear.
What are your plans? Oh, it's such a beautiful fall day.
Well, I thought I might clean the car, honey.
Oh, but it's more important to plant the bulbs.
Plant the bulbs? What bulbs?
The Dutch bulbs, you know, tulips and daffodils and hyacinths.
But I thought they were spring flowers.
Of course they are, silly, but you've got to plant them now, or we won't have any flowers in the spring.
Gee, is there a lot of work to it?
Oh, nothing at all, darling. Just dig a hole 6 inches deep with a trowel, drop the bulb in, and cover.
Well, if that's all there's to it, I'll plant 100 or more Dutch bulbs and still have time to clean the car.